I'm going to avoid using the many slides that I have for a while because I prefer simply recollections. So as you say, the first time I met John was at the Leicester meeting in 1965. But the background for that is that John had specialized in isomorphism types, recursive isomorphism types of orderings in his dissertation. And that goes back it's the theory that's analogous to the one that Jim Decker invented in the early 1950s. The Decker theory was based on simply taking 1-1 partial recursive functions and classifying the equivalence classes, for which you can do in an effective way addition and multiplication. And he was interested in the arithmetic of these things, and particularly the arithmetic of the ones that correspond to the Dedekind finite cardinals, which are where you cannot actually get a hold of a genuinely infinite subset by an RE procedure. So he turned up at the University of Chicago as a instructor in the College of Arts and Sciences in 1952 when I was in graduate school. And as a matter of fact, John Myhill turned up at the same time. And between them, they tried to organize recursion theory in such a way as to bring out this theory of what we later called Dedekind finite things, but the original name was the theory of isols, the theory of addition and multiplication and exponentiation of them. And we had a large group of logic students there, so everybody knew what everybody else was doing. That's not what I did my dissertation on. What I did my dissertation on was under Saunders MacLean, and a different subject. But I was extremely interested in the results they were getting because I thought of it as the first attempt to do, a successful attempt to figure out what happens to arithmetic in the absence of the axiom of choice. So I got very much involved in that subject after I got my degree, and basically worked out the meta theory of that subject and some relatively deep theorems which were in Annals of Mathematics, which at that time was the most prestigious of the journals. And I assume that somewhere in that line that John picked up on all of this, and that he had himself begun developing the corresponding thing for orderings, which is much harder and which is not really that well developed to this day, though it would be if perhaps if we had come out of a later generation. It turned out, by the way, that one of my fellow students, which was Paul Cohen, who was not a logician, but knew the logicians very well and asked for what problems would be best to solve. The continuum problem, of course, was the one that was pointed out to him, which he actually took care of a few years later. Once the forcing method was introduced, interest moved entirely into strange models of set theory, and the subject which we had worked out gradually became unpursued, even though they're really quite interesting and hard. I would only say in retrospect that the papers of the early 1960s contained special cases of the priority method in exactly the form that we now use it in, but it was never really followed up in later years. That's why I say that if we were pursuing it now, we would get substantially further. So that's sort of the early history, which is that John set up his theory of isomorphism, of recursive isomorphism types of orderings, got a certain distance in it, and then jumped in with me for our work. And I'll talk about that a little later. But what was very interesting to me about this, and which I found out about after 1965, was the fact that John had such a independent background. When I say independent, I mean that he graduated from a very fine what do you call it? In England, I don't know what you call it, but grammar school, which I have the notes that he sent me, and as a scholarship student, and went to Oxford as a scholarship student. And the person he worked under in order to get his PhD in this subject was a prominent algebraist who had a huge number of students and had to be fairly broad-minded because this is so far from the interest that he had. But when John actually got a position at Oxford after getting his degree, or what was remarkable was that as a very, very junior person, as a fellow in a fine college, as a very junior person, he attracted the people who might be interested in logic, but where there had not been anybody to work under in logic. In other words, John broke the ice for PhD students in logic at Oxford. The students that he produced are among the most eminent people of their generation. Of course, he had many students, and only some of them were the most eminent people of their generation. But really, he created the logic faculties, so to speak, of the English universities. That was the first. He brought the English universities into modern logic. To do that as a fellow and not a professor is a remarkable feat. John is boundless in energy, or at least was. Boundless in energy means that whatever he has done, he'd like to do something new. Instead, after he became a permanent fellow at All Souls, I guess it was, after he became a permanent fellow there, when he took this job at Monash in Australia as a full professor, because he didn't see that there was a line of advancement at Oxford for him. When he did that, we were working together, and the various English people that I knew simply couldn't believe that someone who was a permanent fellow at that Oxford college, I guess All Souls was all through, that such a person would leave it for any reason at all. And it does have a very strong pull, but John is just simply an extremely independent person in all regards. With respect to the students, his students did not do dissertations in the areas in which John was working. He managed to, at a very young age, take on students in a variety of areas, all of which, the best of which made their mark in the areas in which they were put. This itself is not unique. His own advisor, John's own advisor, did that, but it is fairly unusual. In other words, that you get first of all, you get students that are good enough so that they can work entirely on their own, and that can actually choose the problems which you're not working on and never did, and that you can encourage them and get them to have degrees. Perhaps the reason I looked at is because I did exactly the same thing, and I haven't found many of my colleagues in that kind of a category. They tend to produce people who are specialists in the fields in which they specialize. So, but when John actually did this move to Australia, his first wife felt sort of dragged along. She had a remarkable background in the sense of coming up from a very modest background. Her father was, what do you call it, a Thatcher. She came from a family where there were no graduates of anything to speak of. That she was the first in her family to go through the whole system and ended up at, I guess, St. Anne's with a position. And John dragged her to Australia, where she spent the rest of her life. And she just spent it very productively, even though she really, she often said that she preferred to stay in, she would have preferred to just simply stay in England, but nonetheless, she made a very successful career and died a few years ago. And in any case, this is all sort of prior to John's actually visiting me. What John did, which I thought was very clever, was there were three logicians at Cornell at that time, me and Gerald Sachs and Cy Cochin. Cy spent his career afterwards at Princeton, and of course, Gerald spent the last half of his career at Harvard. So we had a very rather strong logic group. He invited all three of us to this meeting in Leeds, and we sort of speculated that the reason for that is that he wanted an invitation back, which he got. So he and his wife and his daughter Cressida visited us in Ithaca, and we proceeded to work. And he was the work that I was doing with him got harder and harder, and culminated in a book published in 1974 in the Ergebnisse series. At that time, John had made the suggestion that instead of doing whatever that subject is, which is recursive equivalence types of real structures, that really this should be done in categories rather than in a fixed structure. And it was much easier to do it in a fixed structure, so we did. But at this point, all these years later, John was actually right. The thing would have been smoother and actually had many more applications if we had followed his suggestions and done it more or less categorically. So it's just in retrospect saying something like that. So, but now once John got to Australia, his Wanderlust was extreme. In other words, he was everywhere in Southeast Asia, and I followed him. In other words, I had access at that time to a program of the National Science Foundation, which founded which sponsored one-time conferences and the books that result from them in new places, anywhere in the world. I got more of those than anybody else, like 10, 12 of them, and the books for them are all in the Springer series of lecture notes. In any case, between the two of us, we actually produced the first logic meetings at a great number of Southeast Asian institutions. My favorite example is, I was the only one there, John was not at this one. My favorite example was I'd arranged something at the University of Malaysia because there was at least one person there who could be proselytized. I arrived there and was met by a limousine with the president of the University of Malaya on it, who turned out to be a young chemist from the United States, but the only person at that time with the academic credentials to be president of that university. We had there were a bunch of things of that sort. Another one was John knew Father Nebris, who got his PhD at Stanford, probably with Saul Pfefferman, I'm not sure. At Stanford, he's a Jesuit priest, and as an extremely educated Jesuit priest, when he went back to Manila at Ateneo University, at the Jesuit University there, by the time we got to him, he was actually running the place as, I've forgotten what his rank was, but in any case, he was a kind of a chief administrative officer. Now, my anecdote there is that this was a John contact, not my contact. And I went there, they treated me very well. And at one dinner, they decided to use me as a wedge to get an Institute of Mathematics, because at that time, the Philippines did not have an institute. So we made the pitch to President Marcos, and he said, sure. And I was told to put a notice of this in the notices of the American Math Society. I did, it was published, and then he was immediately overthrown. But that was a fascinating piece of, but this was due to just one of many of John's many contacts. Another experience of that sort with John was at, he took me to Tasmania, and I lectured at and I lectured there as well. When I signed their book of lecturers, I discovered that it was a very small number of people who had visited the university there and signed that book. And the previous one was Serge Lang, who was I knew from the time he was a postdoc, but it was a very interesting experience. So I tagged along with John on a certain number of these expeditions, but the thing is that you can't keep him down. He was the amount of energy John had was much greater than any activity that I can think of would be able to absorb. After all of this, there was a certain point after the publication of our Ergebnis volume that he decided that the younger generation coming along, of which he was responsible for a portion from Oxford, but there were many from the United States and elsewhere, he decided that he'd done his part and that he would leave these hard technical arguments to the younger generation who might be better at it than he would be. And he decided to explore his interest in the history of mathematics, but also in various kinds of ancient history. And I copied from the Google Scholar the first page of his publications and the last page of his publications. In the first page of these publications, my name appears many times, and they were all math papers. The last page of the publications and a couple of the previous ones consists entirely of historical articles on various subjects where he had done a substantial amount of historical research. So he spent this last part of his career as a really a historian, specializing in mathematical history, but in fact, a lot of other topics as well. And it's very impressive to look at that list and look at the first page and the last page of the 300 articles or so, because they are so different in character and simply require, for most people, a different collection of talents, but they didn't require a different collection of talents with John. He managed to do both. This is a kind of a brief summary of some of the things about John. What happened in Melbourne was that he got there and going to Australia and reestablishing himself there as some sort of a center for graduate work. That was not enough for him. In other words, he was, after that, this boundless amount of energy led him to an infinite number of other projects into the history of these various, this list of these various histories. What I'm going to do, this was the reason I did not give an abstract of this talk is that it's out of the back of my head. I wanted to say something about a couple of the particular people. If you look at John's list of students, in that list, you find Chris Ash and Rod Downey. I just wanted to say a word about that. Chris Ash was a student of John, not in recursion theory, in England before at Oxford. He had his degree and he went with John to Melbourne, where he was a reader. His interest was almost 100% in algebra at that time. And not only that, he was not very respectful of the recursion theorists. In other words, he didn't know what they did, and he didn't regard it as something that he wanted to study. What happened was that there was one meeting that we had, I can't remember the year, probably 1979, because that probably sounds right, a meeting in Melbourne in 1979. And I think in that connection, I was interested in getting around Chris Ash's disinterest in recursion theory. So I gave a lecture in which I did not admit to having proved a theorem. And he looked at it and it was algebraic enough so that he was interested in it. And he went home and the next day he came back with the proof. And that was fine. That was the so-called Ash Nerode theorem, which the recursion theorists amplified in many ways later. But he always thought that I had put my name on his paper, but in fact, there's one of these things where it was a hook in order to get him interested. He progressed to an incredible extent. In other words, at the time he died his unfortunate death, he had a general form of priority arguments, which have now been published because of one of our female colleagues who was with him at the time that he died. It's fully comparable with the two or three other general methods of doing priority arguments that were due to, for example, my student Lerman and others. So that was a case in which every single year after we went with John to Australia, I would get a call once a year saying that he was thinking of going back to England and he simply didn't have any self-confidence. I did my best to supply self-confidence, his confidence every single year. But as I say, he died an unfortunate death. But he did really convert from algebra to recursion theory. And I think Rod Downey, who's listed as a student of Crossley, is as much a student of Chris Ash. He's here, so he can tell us. I don't think I ever told you that story, Rod. Do you remember? No, I didn't.
No, I can't recall you saying that.
Well,
I know that I know that Chris became obsessed with saying we can't just do all these ad hoc arguments. There must be some general methods. So.
Yeah, well, I never gave any. This last story I did not give during his lifetime. He needed constant. He was terrific, but he needed constant propping. And I got this call from Australia every year, telling me how miserable he was. And should he go back to England and go on the dole? That was terrible. And he was doing terrific work, and he didn't lack in company. So that's one of my memories of one of John's later students. But I'm mentioning it specifically now because Rod is here, and I think I've heard from Rod in the past that was his major contact in recursion theory. Am I right?
It was Chris and I did talk a lot, and we wrote that single paper together. And I remember I used to have big arguments with him. But also, I think your students, Rick Smith, and who were enabled to go to Australia because of John's contacts, Rick Smith and Jeff Remmel were highly influential, actually. Okay,
well, as I have not mentioned the interactions of my many pupils with John's many pupils, and I don't think I will. There are too many people involved. But it's been a very lively period. It was a very lively period. After the 1990s, I basically went into a different part of logic, which became very prominent. That's not logic at all, actually. That's theory of hybrid interacting digital and continuous systems, and that's fared very well. But these are really old recollections to a very large extent. But I have not given a sort of a proper account of the last 20 years, but that's for a very good reason. John, when was the last time I saw you?
About 4 or 5 years ago.
For a day or so, right? For a very short time.
Sarah's saying 2015 or thereabouts, and
okay.
we visited Ithaca. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm not sure whether I want to bring any of the real slides up. I think I'm going to. But I think what I'm going to do is to terminate this collection of recollections and ask for anybody else's recollections, which seems to me to be a good way to start a conference. So is anybody willing to speak up? I mean, John is always willing to speak up, but Rod Downey is more appropriate.
I was going to save some talks at the preface of my talk tonight, really. So I'd like to save them till then, really. There was a very nice group, and there was a very nice logic group in Monash at the time.
So can I extract anything else from anyone else? By the way, I never mentioned John's own division of his career into quite separate parts. The Oxford part, the building computer science and logic at Monash, and then going into the history of mathematics and the history of philosophy, and then into somewhat specialized historical topics. But he actually has had at least 3 careers, one after the other. As I say, he's a person of boundless energy. I actually don't want to put up the slides that I have. I mean, all they are is a documentation of what I've just said.
I can mention one thing.
Good.
I think it was 1974, there was a summer research institute which the Australian Math Society ran, and John volunteered for this. Apparently, as a new professor, he got a largest grant to spend on equipment. Being a magician, he didn't need any, so he organized this conference, and he got prominent people in all the areas of mathematics, and Anil was one of them. I think it was 1974 in January. And I was at that and enjoyed it immensely. Very, very good talks from everybody and beautifully organized.
One of the characteristics of the many conferences that John organized was having evening social sessions in which people actually really did discuss things. The one that was the most impressive over all these many years was when we had Steve Claney in Melbourne, and there was wine and cheese evening, and we asked Claney various detailed questions about the history of his recursion theory with Church and Rosser. And he answered them in detail, and we published them. But the thing is, we published them through John's attempt at a publishing company, the Upside Down A publishing company. And somehow almost all traces of that have disappeared, but it's a really good, it was one of these things which was very enlightening, not only to the youngest people, but to us middle-aged people too, to see exactly.
Sorry, Anil, but your memory is slipping there. These talks were published in the Springer Lecture Notes, volume 450, the Algebra and Logic, and the first part of that. And Guille recently put the audio on the web, and Guillermo will give
So
you
those are actually available on the web.
Yeah.
Tell me the name of the volume again. I mean, on the what's listed on the web? Well, what's it listed in? Or
it's Algebra and Logic, the Springer Lecture Notes number 450.
oh, okay. That's okay. So that actually exists. It's actually worth.
It's out there, and it's available on the web. And because you gave permission for it to be put on the web, apart from other people.
Very good.
In the chat, Liz Sonnenberg has probably put the link.
Oh, thanks, Liz.
Okay. So can I draw out any general comments from the past from the people who've known John for a long time and who will not be giving long speeches?
Oh.
Wilfred, how about you?
Well, I am going to be speaking at length tomorrow, but can I throw in one thing here?
Yeah.
John and I were two of the people, as you said, who worked in different areas. But after we'd both left Oxford, we both found ourselves working in history of mathematics or mathematical logic. And as a result of this, we both independently got to know Charles Burnett at the Warburg Institute, who's an expert in transfer of ideas across cultures.
Uh-huh.
Now, there's a thing about Charles Burnett. I'm quite often in touch with him. And whenever I am, John comes up in the conversation. And Charles always says the same thing. Charles always says, "Isn't it wonderful how young my student John Crossley is looking?" And I say, "No, Charles, you got that wrong. I was John Crossley's student, not the other way around. John is 4 years older than me." And Charles always says, no, you can see. Just look at him. He's so young. You can see the youthful energy.
He has the only other person who's on this screen who has had a comparable amount of energy is Rod Downey.
Uh-huh.
Because Rod took on an enormous number of, how to put it, if I were currently producing postdocs in recursion theory, I would do what all my colleagues have done for the last 15 years. I'd send them to New Zealand to work with Downey. He's taken people who are pretty good and pushed them to the extreme. So, everybody has their own talent. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, I see Bob's been trying to say something. His sound's a bit funky. So Bob, if you want to jump in first, then I'll go.
I tried to fix up my mic. Is it working better now?
Yes, that's better.
Oh, great. Yeah, I just have a small anecdote about John. This was, I think the year was 1991. There was a birthday conference for Anil, no less, 65th birthday or something like that. I contributed a paper in intuitionistic set theory. It was the first one that I did in that subject. At Anil's prompting, I might add. And I remember after the talk or sometime after the talk, John coming up to me and encouraging me to write it up and to continue working in it, telling me that he thought that it was important work. And, I just remember what a boost that was to me. It was as I said, the first work I had done in constructive set theory, and I didn't know what kind of resonance that it would find. And it was a pleasure for me and important to me to hear that John was interested in it and thought that it was useful and was encouraging.
Very good. Jeff, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I thought, over the next day, there's going to be many people talking about their memories of John and the things he's done. I was wondering if I could impose on John to cast his eye around the faces on the screen and maybe have a couple of highlights of things that he remembers about some of us, particularly interesting ones. And just be warned, I'm going to go and see Diamond Head in 10 minutes, John, so I'm going to cut you off in 10 minutes. Now go. You're muted.
I tend to abbreviate everything. I could have made the same remarks in an hour instead of half an hour. So can I get anything?
I think the one influence we did miss, Anil, was Jean-Yves Girard, because in the 1990s, we were working on his thesis and going through his thesis, and that led to a lot of the work that I did with Martin Viersing and then with Iman Pornomo, which was, program extraction from proofs. And this is really Jeff Sutcliffe's sort of, closer to his area. Oh, so yeah. I remember vividly the conference in Jamaica where there was a lot of rum drunk. And but it was really Jeff's been organizing these conferences in exotic places for many years now, but that was great fun, so that was fine. Rod Downey through Guillermo sent me had said that I supervised him in a very I think English was the word way, that was very hands off, but gave him access to my personal library and introduced him to other people. And that's fine. I have said elsewhere, and Rod, you will bear with me, that I didn't teach you any mathematics, but I did teach you to write better English. So that's my claim to fame with you. So, look, I know most of these faces. Rohit is probably the person I've known longest, because that was from '63. Then Alfred Manister, who did manage to get out to Australia. And I remember seeing him in Princeton, first of all, and where I was introduced to this strange American custom of heating one's meat outside in a very primitive way called a barbecue, which was very strange to my English eyes, because I was still in England at that time. Then there are all sorts of other people. There's, besides Jeff, there's Tim Brooke, whose thesis I examined, and we became friends after that, which was really nice. Liz Sonnenberg, whose thesis was delayed because she and Bill Gross worked so hard for the '74 conference, which was a great success. I really think that was terrific, and I'm very grateful. More grateful now than I was then, I think. So, but that was really nice. But and Roland, there was a political crisis at Monash, and I got shunted into computer science, and so I started doing things that were computer science related in logic. And Roland was amazing and taught me lots of things. I don't know that I taught him very much, but one of the things that I remember, apart from nice meetings with his father, was that Roland was a voracious reader and reading everything, and that meant that when it came to writing up stuff, he wrote very nicely indeed. So that was really good. So Leto, my last student I see, is here. Wilfred Hodges is like Rod Downey. I didn't teach him anything. I was just there as a facilitator. But I think I was thinking about this, you know, that my university at the moment is forever going on about innovation. And I think I'm more of a facilitator than an innovator. And that you know, the interaction with the people is really been the nicest things. One of the things that I was thinking of over the last couple of days was, you know, Isaac Newton saying that he stood on the shoulder of giants. I think what's been nicest for me is to have walked with giants, and quite literally with Steve Cleaney, we walked up Watkins Glen Falls one time when I was in the States, and it was just, you know, some of these guys that are lovely to be with. There are some other people who are not lovely to be with, although they're very brilliant. And I've tolerated them, and now I can look back with amusement, but at the time it was sometimes a little bit tough and so on. But so, you know, it's a big thank you to everybody. And I just have here, this is the book with Nerode on combinatorial functions. You can't read the cover, but it's, Anil inscribed it in 1974. May all future plans be as easily pursued. Thank you.
The one thing that I didn't really touch on strongly is the way in which the logicians founded computer science departments. Many of the logicians who actually founded the computer science departments are people who worked on sort of models, but actually never did any serious programming at all. I mean, John, one of the things that John did, which I did not emphasize, was to really set up the computer science program at Monash. Years earlier, in the 1963, actually, before I met John, I set up the computer science department at Cornell. One of my students, Bob Soar, set up the one at Chicago, and basically a bunch of the logicians working in parts of recursion theory or computability that have nothing to do with actual computing, ended up, so to speak, founding computer science departments out of goodwill, in order to be sure that their universities didn't fall behind and were offering the correct things to the students. And John actually did that for Monash. Having said that, there's something else that John did earlier, which I did not mention. John used to mention it, but it hasn't been mentioned. By his taking on these PhD students at Oxford when he was a young man, he basically set up the structures that were required in order to make it attractive for my pal Dana Scott to go to Oxford temporarily. I say temporarily because he finally found that the Oxford salaries were too unsuitable and came home. But in between, he really started Oxford out on a good route for foundations of computer science. But John actually set up I doubt if Dana would have gone there if John hadn't already done the spade work in setting it up. John, is that a fair statement?
You have to mention Michael Dummett as well. Michael,
of course. Yeah.
Somewhat older than me. He was one of my PhD examiners, but he was just wonderfully supportive. It sort of, he was the one who put me on to Decker and Myhill's recursive equivalence types. Michael wasn't really pushy, but he was, when I had ideas and that, he was just so tremendously supportive, and he remained a friend until he died. So, it's really great. And the other person that should be mentioned is John Shepperson, who was at Bristol, and he was very supportive in the early days when things were just developing at Oxford. So we're talking 63 to 68, so, which is quite a while ago now.
It is quite a while ago. But one of the things that is important is that when the so-called Association for Computing Machinery actually became an institution which covered theoretical computer science, and that was took a considerable time to do that. A number of the people who made that conversion were logicians who specialized in computability theory. It's natural, but I mean, there was a transition point between Association for Computing Machinery, which is a bunch of, just how they're designing the machines and programming on them. There was a transition point to actually teaching computer science as a scientific discipline. And I think the recursion theorists and some played a very crucial role actually in making that transition. And the Oxford transition was the Cornell transition, the Chicago transition, and so on. They all came about the same day. Most of them were about in the same decade. So,
to give another example of computing and logic, I was Haskell Curry's last student, and during the Second World War, he volunteered for war work. But being in his 40s, he was shunted off to a group that developed the first computers there. After the war, coming back to Penn State, he asked his university president if he could have a computer. He was told no, so he went back to theoretical work on combinatorial logic.
Yeah, I have to comment on that. After J. Barclay Rosser left Cornell, Curry, who made an annual visit, from Penn State to Ithaca, substituted me for Rosser. In other words, I met with Haskell yearly until he died, basically. And he actually was personally, how to put it, disturbed or angry that his work was actually useful.
Yes.
He regarded himself as more of a philosopher, the foundations, than a technician. working, say, in computability. And he didn't like the idea that that somehow the emphasis it would be on the lambda calculus as a programming tool. I found that very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, but he was basically rejecting the fact that he had put together a useful subject. Some people really are only theoreticians. Are there any interesting other anecdotes of the same sort? Oh, not of the same sort, of any sort. Martin's is a good one.
Go ahead, Tim.
Sorry, Tim, your audio is not right. You might have to restart the audio, or maybe leave the room, the Zoom room, and enter again. That might work as well. Apologies. No, it's still weird. It's very.
That's what's known as chipmunk voice. It happens to me on occasion.
Yeah.
Switch your microphone to another microphone and then back again, it might work, or log
Right.
out and log back in again.
Yep. That's the technique here.
It happens to me about a third of the time.
Yeah, it's very mysterious. Yeah, sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. It's
Okay, can you hear now?
yeah, perfect now. Please go ahead.
Oh, right, okay, good. I was going to say, because I'm a lapsed mathematician, I won't be attending most of the talks, but I was once a mathematician. And when I started my PhD, I was taken very soon to meet Peter Fried at a conference in Sydney. And there was a young fellow who I assumed was another PhD student who was talking to Peter. And I thought, oh, this guy is going to go a long way. He's really very bright. It turned out he was already a full professor, and that was John Crossley. But because I mistook him for a PhD student and he was talking to Peter Fried, I assumed that PhD students were able to go up and talk to this eminent mathematician. So I joined in and actually learned a lot by having John being so approachable.
Well, I'll give one Peter Fried anecdote. When I had won and was running a mathematical science institute sponsored by the Army Research Office, which is in the 1990s, I was down at Penn and went to a party with Peter Fried. And his main interest was for me to tell him how to get military contracts. And the anecdote that there was that I told him that the very famous mathematicians, I mean the Fields medalists, who had applied for the $10 million that was being offered by the Army at that point, apparently are so self-centered that they never actually read the requirements that the Army had put out for their institute. In other words, they hadn't actually read the thing for which they were applying. So they put in a proposal that would be appropriate for the National Science Foundation in the US or for European Science Circle, but not one which met any of the Army interests. I had the Cornell one rewritten to meet the Army interests. But he wanted to know how you get money, and the institute is you look at the one who wants to give it to you and you please them.
Bernard Neumann had difficulties with Peter Fried. He described Peter as acting like he was a great genius when actually he was only a little one.
Sorry, I think that Rohit has a comment. Rohit, please go ahead.
Yeah, since I'm speaking next, I'm not going to say anything about John Crossley, but I can certainly say something about Anil, whose theorem I've taught many, many times. I mean, including the last, I would say that the Anil Nerode theorem in finite automata is one of the most beautiful results ever. And I think that it has some connection perhaps with the transition of ACM from machines to theory, because if I remember correctly, the famous paper by Scott and Rabin and Scott didn't appear in ACM, but it appeared in the IBM journal. And I don't remember now where Anil's paper appeared, but I remember about intending to teach his theorem. I said, well, why don't I go back to the original source and read what Anil said about it? And then I realized that the paper was too difficult and it would be easier for me to prove it myself, which I did and then taught. Now, many of the people that Anil talks about, like Dana Scott, Kreisel, Myhill, right? Myhill I knew very, very well, and I even taught some of his classes when he was having one of his incidents. But I didn't meet Anil at that time. And I always wondered whether he was Indian, whether he had grown up in India, whether he was Indian by ancestry or whatever. And then I think much later I found out that he was born in India, that he is of Indian ancestry, and he has grown up in America. Am I right about this?
No, I was born in Los Angeles.
You were born in Los Angeles, right? But I
spent all of 6 weeks in Los Angeles before my father started going on his lecture tours.
Right. But since I'm 85 and I see the impressive ages of Anil's parents and grandparents, I'm thinking of changing my name to Nerode, and that will have another advantage, which is that if somebody's name begins with a P, then my name in alphabetical order as Nerode will come first. That's a side effect which I think is good.
So let me make a comment on that Rabin and Scott paper.
Yes.
I was a postdoc at the Institute, and Rabin and Scott were both graduate students. And Rabin gave an enormously long, complicated combinatorial proof of a theorem about finite automata, but a very long proof. And I listened to it for an hour. And then I said, you can actually give a 4-line proof for this. And he got very angry, and I just simply handed him the paper that you found difficult to read.
Yes.
And then the next day, he and Scott turned up at my office in other words, they absorbed, their exposition was based on my exposition. But it won them a Turing Award, one of the earliest ones. Of course, Scott was my friend for ever since he was a student. And we are definitely the older generation. He is exactly 1 month younger than I am. His birth, I think his birthday is probably this week. He's also 90. But he retired a long time ago.
Well, I think that everyone wants to reach the 90s with the energy that you have. So this is really...
And of course, I would like to have the energy that John Crossley has.
Okay.
Yes.
Alfred, you've seen these people all these years. Don't you have any comment at all?
So I guess my comment would be how John and I met, and it's a strange way to develop what's turned out to be a 60-year friendship. But when I was a student of Anil's, I was working hard on a thesis, and I came into his office one day, and he looked at me and said, "Your thesis is finished." And I thought, that was easy. And then he pointed out, it was finished by some guy in Oxford named Crossley. So when John came to Cornell, we met, and this was the beginning of a very long and for me, very fruitful friendship. So I am very grateful to John for putting up with me all these years. I guess the other story that's worth telling, since John mentioned that I introduced him to barbecues, which I didn't know. When I was in Australia one time, we had a barbecue at a preserve, and there was someone there from Hong Kong. John, you probably remember who that was. Pardon me?
KP Sum.
Right, okay. So we were at this barbecue and we had barbecued lamb chops that were thin cut and very good. And Sook had the lamb chop on a plate on his hand, and a kookaburra came down and pinched the lamb chop, just picked the whole thing up and flew off with it. And John said, not to worry, we'll get you another one. So we got him another one and put it on his plate, and he held it up, and the kookaburra came back and picked the one. So those are two of my favorite John stories, but the first one is much more important, of course.
Can I just add to that, Alfred, that when the kookaburra came in the second or third time, KP Sum managed to grab it, and then he asked us what they tasted like.
I didn't know that.